The price of oil has now spiked significantly, and that means that Russia's treasury once again will start to fill up. And that means it will be easier and faster for Russia to fund the war against Ukraine. What this does is it de-incentivizes any likelihood. It de-incentivizes Russia from returning to the bargaining table.
The Pentagon says today it will bring the most intense US strikes on Iran yet, despite suggestions from President Trump, yes, it is confusing, that the fighting will end soon.
Today will be, yet again, our most intense day of strikes inside Iran. The most fighters, the most bombers, the most strikes. Intelligence more refined and better than ever.
Pete Hegseth, he's the US Secretary of War. The biggest oil exporter in the world, Saudi Aramco, says there'll be catastrophic consequences for markets if the war continues. But the White House is dropping some sanctions on Russian oil to bring the prices down. Here's Donald Trump saying last night that he'd had a word with Vladimir Putin.
I had a very good call with President Putin. We had a lot of people on the line from our side, from his side. We were talking about Ukraine, which is just a never-ending fight. And look, there's tremendous hatred between President Putin and President Zelensky. They can't seem to get it together. But I think it was a positive call on that subject. And we obviously talked then about the Middle East. And he wants to be helpful. I said, you could be more helpful by getting the Ukraine-Russia war over with. That would be more helpful. But we had a very good talk.
Well, you know who that was. That was him talking about his conversation with Vladimir Putin. Charles Hecker is a geopolitical risk analyst and author of the book Zero Sum, which is about international business in Russia. Welcome, Charles. Thank you very much for coming in.
It's a pleasure.
First of all, the conversation between Putin and Trump. The war in Ukraine it's less likely to end, isn't it? Because Russia's making loads more money now out of oil.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the war in Iran largely has been nothing but a net positive for Russia. The price of oil has now spiked significantly, and that means that Russia's treasury once again will start to fill up. And that means it will be easier and faster for Russia to fund the war against Ukraine. What this does is it de-incentivizes any likelihood. It de-incentivizes Russia from returning to the bargaining table. Talks were in Geneva just a few weeks ago and were slated to continue. And right now, there's no reason for President Putin to engage in negotiations. Things for him now, financially and then militarily, are going quite well. Yeah,
but Donald Trump in that clip we played he doesn't make that connection at all, does he? He's just not willing to in public, or he doesn't see it. What is it?
Well, I don't think that he wants to openly admit that this is helpful to Russia. I think on some level, hopefully, he understands that this is what's happening, or at least somebody in the administration is telling him this. I think intuitively, everybody understands that higher oil prices benefit the Russian budget. And so I guess what this tells you is that the president is making decisions and setting priorities, and that the lower priority on that list is the war on Ukraine, and the higher one is the global energy market, and of course the messaging to the American public, particularly in light of the fact that we have an election in November.
The midterms are coming, and the price of gas, as they call it in America, hugely significant to the MAGA base and indeed to everybody in America. So what does Trump do?
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, the price of gasoline at the pump in the United States is one of the U.S. consumers' most painful metrics. This is what hurts Americans in their wallets more than almost anything else, aside from, say, the price of groceries or interest rates. And the Democrats are going to hammer Trump and the Republicans on affordability and the cost of living. And so every time the price of oil goes up at the barrel, the price of gasoline goes up at the pump. Americans are incredibly sensitive to this, and they will be made even more sensitive to this by the Democrats. So, President Trump's number one priority is not to derail the elections for the Republicans in November.
But in that case, has this not been thought through? The attack on Iran was only ever going to cause exactly this situation.
That's right. It would be almost impossible to imagine that the White House, the State Department, the Treasury, the National Security Council, the Defense Department. It would be almost impossible to imagine that nobody in these organizations thought of or told the president to think about or anticipate a spike in energy prices. What the president has said publicly is that he understands that energy prices are rising, but it will be short-lived, and it's worth the trade-off for whatever his latest goal in Iran may be.
And that's the problem. We still don't really know what that goal is.
No, you're right. I mean, there's been very little clarity and very little consistency in the messaging coming out of Washington. Not to mention that there are two parties really prosecuting this war. And so we're told this is to dismantle the Iranian regime. We're told that this is to dismantle their nuclear capability. We're told that this is because the president has the back of the Iranian public. And, you know, those messages sort of go on rotation as the war proceeds. And we're not quite sure which one is most important and what the impact will be of any of them.
But what we do know is that what the president said yesterday did bring the oil price down.
That's right. What the president did, I think quite deliberately, is he literally talked down the markets. He talked up the share price index, and he talked down the price of petrol, the price of oil, and the price of natural gas. Once the markets closed, however, yesterday evening in the United States, he began to talk again about ramping up the military effort. And just as we heard Pete Hegseth a moment ago say that, you know, as he says every day, that this is going to be the heaviest day of bombing, the war continues essentially as ever before.
Yeah, so yesterday the war was going to end. Today the war has intensified. I mean, what are we supposed to think?
We're supposed to pay very, very careful attention to the news. And I think that a rational mind would assume that whatever the goal of the war in Iran may be on behalf of the United States, that it's not going to be achieved that quickly. Dismantling Iran's nuclear capacity, regime change, and liberation of an oppressed people, none of that is going to happen overnight. And it's not going to happen in the time frame that President Trump is forecasting. And I think one of the risks that we run in all of this is that President Trump does end the war, and none of the goals, whatever they may be, have been achieved.
Well, Katie Balls, who's the Washington correspondent for The Times, has written a great piece. It's online at the moment on thetimes.com. And she says, basically, nobody expects consistency from Donald Trump. He can say what he likes pretty much whenever he likes. And he sets his own rules. And if he says the war's over, then it's over.
Well, and basically it's down to the rest of us to sort of read between the lines or look at tea leaves. And right now, commodity markets and energy traders and the stock markets and the share indices around the world are doing their best to try to interpret a consistent message out of a rather typical Trumpian militarized word salad.
Yeah. The American administration, I think, has pointed to Venezuela and has suggested that oil production there has increased since the takeover, or Delcy Rodriguez taking charge. Is that true?
The situation in Venezuela appears to be improving. And that is that, first of all, Delcy Rodriguez and what's left of the Maduro administration, which is everybody except Maduro himself, is cooperating with President Trump. The Venezuelan oil industry is in a fairly difficult state. I mean, the refineries, the transportation infrastructure, the ports have all suffered throughout the Maduro regime and won't return to perfect working condition anytime in the immediate future at all. And Venezuela, as much oil as it has, is not in a position to replace or substitute the blockage of Iranian oil that normally transits through the Strait of Hormuz. So while things may be going better in Venezuela, that doesn't take the pressure off global oil markets.
Okay, and the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, is it possible for shipping to get through the Strait right now?
Right now, no. The risks are still too high. It is almost impossible to get insurance, and when you do, it is prohibitively expensive, and we know that nobody is going to go through the Straits of Hormuz without insurance. The president has promised, potentially, a military escort to open up the Strait of Hormuz. He's suggested taking over the Strait of Hormuz, but until that very narrow choke point of water opens up, there will only be upward pressure on the price of oil.
Just briefly, if you can, Charles, are you surprised by all this, or is this current situation something you might have anticipated?
It's very, very hard to be surprised anymore by what's coming out of the Oval Office. The amount of inconsistency, not just on Iran, but on geopolitics in general, on Ukraine, on India, on China, on spheres of influence. I think that we had a rehearsal for this during Trump 1.0. Trump 2.0 is that world on steroids. And I think that one of the reasons why the world feels so dangerous, so disrupted, and so uncomfortable right now is that we can't count on the White House and the Oval Office anymore to give us a message that we can rely on.